In case anybody wonders what's going on.
Yeah.
Are you just gonna, do you mean you're gonna stop your video, Matthew?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll be here, not losing you.
Okay.
It's like going to get a sandwich down the street.
If I could only do that at this point.
It's like, I don't need to listen to that guy talk. I already saw it. So
I noticed the last round with Modu, I jumped off and he was like, "Where are you?" But I was here. I think when I turn my video off, my screen pops off. So
yeah, I gave one talk to a university where every single student had a black screen. So I was talking to a bunch of boxes with just names. It was totally bizarre. It's like an hour-long thing. Like, I have no idea how this is landing. It's really, that I think is the hardest part for someone. I mean, I'm used to doing a lot of public speaking, so it's really weird to have absolutely zero feedback whatsoever. So
yeah, with the webinar, it kind of blocks some of that interface, the webinar version. So there's pluses and minuses.
Yeah.
So got more popping in here. Give it a couple more minutes and then we'll begin. There's always kind of a trail of people that join.
Yeah. I'm fine with that. I mean, for me, it's, after 9:30, children will, in theory, stay asleep. So you may hear about me. I don't know if you just heard the youngest a few minutes ago crying. I don't know if you could hear that, but yeah, mom must have got up to go to the bathroom for 1 second. She's 9 months, so
wow.
Oldest is almost 5.5, and she's very happy to be able to be close to 5.5. So
got some good years ahead of you.
Oh yeah. Action packed. It's really strange for the youngest. She's only known a COVID world. I mean, she was born 2 weeks before everything shut down. She was born on leap day. So it's really kind of, she's kind of our COVID. She's our COVID marker. Like, how old is she? Well, that's how long it's all been around. So it's strange. It's hard for, I think it's really hard for the younger kids because they don't see people's faces anymore.
Yeah, I could see
really
that.
Strange. So
wait 1 minute. All right. So we'll go ahead and begin. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for the Holly Ford School of Graduate Studies lecture series. Before we begin, I just want to do a quick announcement. I would like to acknowledge today that we honor the indigenous people whose traditional ancestral homelands we stand on. The Multnomah, the Cathlamet, the Clackamas, the Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapua, and many of the other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It's important that we acknowledge the ancestors of this place to recognize that we are here because of their sacrifices forced upon them, sorry. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, their descendants, past, present, and future. So tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome Phil Sanders with us. longtime friend, colleague, collaborator. I can go on and on. Cassie Ferguson's also going to help us with the intro today, as well as our Q&A session, and Cassie's part of our print media program. And tonight we're kind of joined between the Applied Craft and Design and print media programs. And it looks like we have some students from other programs as well. So welcome all. And Cassie, I'll let you do the intro.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'll get started. So Phil Sanders is an Asheville-based collaborative master printer, artist, educator, and founder of the creative services firm CS Marlowe Incorporated. He received his BFA in printmaking and BA in arts education with a minor in art history from the University of Florida, and received a certificate from the Tamarind Printer Training Program in 2001. Sanders has worked as a collaborative master printer for more than 20 years at presses such as Robert Blackburn Printing Workshop, Universal Limited Art Editions, and Trillium Press, to name a few. He has worked with hundreds of artists to produce thousands of works of art, some of which are housed in the public collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Museum of Modern Art, Whitney Museum of American Art, Library of Congress, Davis Museum, and Yale University Art Gallery. Print education and printer training is also a significant part of Sanders' career, and he lectures and teaches workshops regularly on art, printmaking, collecting, and the business of art. He also collaborates with publishers, taking on the role of master printer, and has set up an invitational print workshop in Asheville, where he prints projects on contract. Sanders' own artwork is included in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Yale University Art Gallery, and the Library of Congress, among others. He recently just wrote and released the book, Prints and Their Makers, published by Princeton Architectural Press. And that's it. Welcome.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. And what I'll be speaking about this evening is drawing things from the book that I just released, as well as diving a little bit deeper into some of the things that are in that book. And we can end, if there's a little bit of time, on a project that I'm currently working on in my studio. Again, I just want to say thank you to Matthew for inviting me to this. And if you all have questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on them, and I'll try to answer them as we go. It doesn't have to be just a me talking at you sort of situation. Feel free to interject. I'm happy to stop and clarify or go a little bit deeper into something that you're particularly interested in. I'm going to focus tonight on some things that are more relief printing based, because a lot of people are working on relief projects now because it's easier to print at home during COVID without necessarily having full access to printing equipment. A lot of places around the country are having difficulty with that in the current climate. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with y'all, and go ahead and get started. So this is the cover of the book, Prints and Their Makers. It was about a 2-year project to get this done. It was just released this past October. So it's moving along. It's out there in the world. Princeton Architectural Press is the publisher, and they approached me to do a book on printmaking because they noticed a growing community of people surrounding printmaking, not just from practitioners, makers, artists, but also people interested in collecting and diving deeper into why people make prints. So we had a long set of conversations to figure out what this book really should be, being that my background is one as a collaborator in print studios, as well as someone who lectures on the history of printmaking, as well as helps publishers, artists, and businesses deal with financial solvency when it comes to arts projects and arts production. And so this book really is about the 3 parties that are present in order to make a print come into the world. There's the artist, or the printmaker. There's the printer, the person who produces that work, and there's the publisher. And even if it's a person who makes the work themselves, who acts as the artist or author, prints the work, and is also paying for the production of it, those 3 roles still need to be satisfied. One of the largest and most kind of important questions that I get on a regular basis is why someone would want to make a print from the artist's perspective. And I start off with this pair of images by Albrecht Dürer. And at the top image, what you have is what's referred to as a state proof, or a print. That's a printing of an impression off of a plate when it's in process, so it's before completion. And below you have a near final state of the plate at the bottom. And this really encapsulates a lot of the reasons why an artist would want to do printmaking in the first place. It affords them an ability to pause and see where they're at and be able to reflect that or compare it directly with the next step. So you can make moves or marks onto a plate, print that to paper. You can then change those things, add to them, and print it again and compare them side by side. There's no real way to do that unless you're taking constant still photography or taking a video of you producing your own work, to be able to have that ability to look backwards at where you were and judge it against where you are without the subjectivity of memory. And so printmaking offers an artist a way to dive back into their own creative process, to open it back up and learn what's necessary in it for themselves, both from a process perspective as well as a conceptual perspective with what they're trying to produce for their audience. So printmaking gives a great deal back to an artist. It also has the added benefit of being able to work with highly skilled people if you're working in a collaborative print environment. And this book really does focus a lot on the collaborative printing environment that is present in contemporary printmaking across the globe. And so some of the things we go into then is that relationship between the artist and the printer, and how there's two different skill sets that are coming together. And I always refer to this as a 1 + 1 = 3 situation. That's what we're going for, where the skills and talents of the artist paired with the skills and talents of the printers together create something that would never have been able or possible to exist without them working together. This idea of the collaborative printer is one it's been around for quite some time, but the way we think about it in more modern terms, where the printer is more than just a technician, but someone who is really helping push the ideas and the concepts and participates in so much more than just merely inking a plate and printing it to paper, which is the traditional concept of a master printer. So the concept of the collaborating master printer was really, well, as we understand it today, was really pioneered and solidified by a man by the name of Robert Blackburn. Pictured there, African-American man, pictured here on screen. And this image is showing him working at Universal Limited Art Editions in 1963, roughly, working with Bob Rauschenberg when he was a very young man. So to kind of explain the situation a bit, Bob Blackburn, as a young man, growing up in New York City and predominantly in Harlem, started working as a studio assistant to Jacob Lawrence when he was 14, was deeply involved with artists of the Harlem Renaissance, and dove, when he was 14, dove headlong into lithography as a print process. He gained a great deal of skill. He worked with Will Barnett at the Art Students League once he graduated from high school, and quickly gained an ability as a printer to not just produce his own work, but produce the work of others and help them push the medium in another way. So he really began this foundation of the concept of the contemporary collaborating printer while working with Will Barnett. And then 1948, when he opened his own workshop, the printmaking workshop in New York City, working with other artists. Now, he founded the printmaking workshop in 1948 because as an African-American man, he was unable to work in the print shops, the other print shops in New York City. Segregation was, New York City was heavily segregated at the time, still is in many ways today. And Bob wanted to create a workshop that was an oasis from that. So his workshop served a lot of African-American artists from across the United States, Afro-Caribbean diaspora, as well as expatriated Jewish artists from Germany and the rest of Europe after the Second World War. So his workshop became this haven for extraordinarily creative people who've been kind of shunned or pushed out from the rest of the normal art world life that we all read about in the history books. So Bob was running this workshop for about 10 years when he became the first master printer for Universal Limited Art Editions, otherwise known as ULAE. He was hired by Tanya Grossman to be her collaborating printer. And what Bob Blackburn brought to the table was not only a great deal of experience, but also mastery of art as an artist himself. So when working with other artists, he used to use his own work as a teaching tool. So Robert Rauschenberg, when he was invited by Tanya Grossman to come out and make lithographs at her studio out in Long Island, he famously responded to her, "The 20th century is no time to start drawing on rocks." And, he's kind of came to eat those words in so many ways. And he did so lovingly, because printmaking became one of the most important parts of his artistic practice for the rest of his life. He ended up setting up his own studio, Untitled Press, at his home in Captiva Island in Florida. The reason it took off in this way, though, for him was because he was paired with a collaborator in Bob Blackburn, who was not only capable of producing anything, but also capable of pushing and challenging him artistically. So the print that's pictured here is accident. It's what's referred to as the print heard around the world. And the reason is that the stone during proofing broke. And Blackburn was proofing it with his assistant Zygmunt Preedy at the time. And Rauschenberg wasn't there. He was intending to come in the morning to see what the proofs were. So Blackburn called Rauschenberg up, told him that he broke the stone. And Rauschenberg said, well, I'll come down and I'll check it out in the morning. We'll see what we can do. Rauschenberg's response to Blackburn was, can you print it? Blackburn's response to himself initially was, the worst thing you can ever do is destroy your artist's matrix. So obviously in his mind, he was said, well, yes, I'll print that. And from anyone who's ever printed a lithograph, this is a technical tour de force to be able to clamp a stone back together that has broken and get an impression off of it. So you would think getting 1 or 2 impressions would be great. Blackburn got an addition of 29. So his mastery and skill as a printer made the work possible, but it was his creative drive and his ingenuity as an artist that made the answer be yes. And this is really what changes the concept of the collaborative master printer, is someone who's willing to push and reach beyond just the basic technical ink to paper, and really help someone achieve something greater conceptually. Because for Rauschenberg, with this image, when the stone broke, it said to him in a really clear-cut way that printmaking doesn't have to be about reproducing the world. It can be about creating a world. Chance can be involved. It can take you places where you didn't know when you started. You can start with an idea and figure out what it's going to look like in your process of getting to the fruition of that idea. For much of printmaking's history up until this point, the vast majority of prints were a reproduction of the world. You think like your New York Times, the money, posters, even my book. It's something that exists that's being replicated exactly through the medium of printmaking. But when you're looking at what happened with accident, what you were trying to do here is reach for something else. It was a world that you did not yet know what defined it, what its confines were, or what it would be. It's that idea of being able to create a world. And it's something that Blackburn used to talk about, of being it's art first that happens to be a print. And so we owe, as printers, we owe a great deal of debt to Bob Blackburn for that. Fast forwarding to some projects that are highlighted in the book. This is a collaborative project between James Siena and Katia Santabanez that was done by May Shore of Shore Publishing up in Tuxedo, New York. And they were actually swapping blocks back and forth. So the book kind of goes over projects and shows detailed imagery on how some of those state proofs come together, gives background on the projects. And here's the 2 final images from their back and forth set of reduction woodcuts. It also really goes into the perspective of how an artist has to think. So there's this pairing of history and historical elements and images, as well as how the process is developed as industrial art as well as creative art. And then it also goes into how an artist has to think in order to draw. So, situations like this is artist Sarah Sanders, one of her insane lithographs, and it shows the drawings that she did in black. So these are Prismacolor drawings on Mylar for each layer, and then how it was printed, and it progresses going through all the yellow to create the final image. And so what you're looking at here is exactly how she saw it. This was a print, as we refer to as print as you go, meaning she drew a layer, we printed it. She responded to that layer by drawing the next, we printed it again. We were actually additioning as we went. So this gives you kind of an understanding of the level of faith that an artist has to have that they can pull it off, not just in themselves, but also in their collaborating printer, of which case I was the printer on this particular project. So, this goes over other things. This is a project with Will Cotton. It goes into great depth on this particular lithographic project, which was also a print as you go project that was done at Flying Horse Editions. This project with Chikaya Booker that's covered in the section on Chine Calais. It was conducted by master printer Justin Sands at the Robert Blackburn printmaking workshop. It also deals with updating the historical canon in many ways. So this is a spread from a section on the history of screen print. Oftentimes when you're talking about the history of screen print, people talk about Anthony Valonis and him and all his pioneering work with fine art screen print, and Andy Warhol, obviously, or Roy Lichtenstein. But a lot of times people like Sister Corita Kent are relegated to her own category and are not included in the larger canon. And someone like Sister Corita Kent, who's an artist in herself, just used her artwork for a different purpose, for a social good. And screen print really has this ability to kind of walk between different worlds. And it has been used for protests. It's been used for propaganda. It's been, right now, it's being used heavily to produce posters and T-shirts and things to promote, the Black Lives Matter movement and all the social justice changes and movements that's been going on, which is a reflection of how screen print was used in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s when you're thinking about the anti-nuke and the punk rock movements and community movements and things like that. So for me, it was important to include more of the figures in the historical canon together rather than these things being in separate sections. So you'll find that coming throughout the book, as well as highlighting projects that may have been missed or overlooked and should be really considered, not just for the power of their graphic imagery, but also what it is that they're doing. Historically, this is a project by Hank Willis Thomas that's using reflectographic screen printing material. So the image you see is kind of what you could see if you looked at it in the gallery. And when you held up your cell phone to take a photograph of it, this is the image you get to see. This is the image of Charles Chambry from 1963 being attacked by a police dog. That's a very famous, was on Life magazine. And it was one of the images that really helped push the civil rights movement to get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and all these things passed through Congress because it changed public consciousness. And what I really loved about Hank's project is that he's taking it the next step further. He's saying it's not enough to just bear witness. He's saying, when you hold your cell phone up and you have a choice, you can take that photograph, you can take that video because you see it now. And he's asking you, how are you going to participate? Or how are you going to be culpable? What are you going to do with this power that you have and your fingertips right now for a positive change? And so there's a lot of artists who are using printmaking as a means of raising important social political issues, major change issues. And then because those images are in multiple, they have the opportunity to spread out to larger audiences. So things like this, there's a theme that runs through the book of all the different processes that goes through. And then also there's image galleries that allow you to balance out just what a process can do. So both of the images you see here, one by Susan Hall on the left and Lynn Myers on the right, are both lithographs. And they're wildly different in their aesthetics as well as their approach, but the process to make them is both the same. What you're seeing here are the Eddie Martinez and the Mel Bachner pieces. These are both monotypes. And, artists have been really gravitating towards more and more processes being able to be used together because they have differing ideas. And so as a printer, I'm always referring to, you want the appropriate process for the appropriate outcome. And so sometimes that means you're going to use screen print with digital, with woodcut, with litho, with etching, all kind of thrown in together because those are the marks you need. And so there's a section on multi-process printmaking as well. And there's an image by Sanford Biggers on the left and Chitra Ganesh on the right. And then one of the other things I wanted to be able to show with this too is that, the processes you see here is the Intaglio Principles are both aquatints, and the wild diversity that an artist can achieve with the process and just how much the processes are driven by the artists, not by the technical aspects of them themselves. So on the left, you have a Kathy Pendergast print that was done at Stony Road Press in Dublin. And you have a print by Mama Anderson that was done at Crown Point Press in San Francisco. So this is that point where I'm going to transition us to a specific project. And one of those projects that's highlighted in the book that I'm going to go into a little bit greater detail and depth for you guys. It's a project with artist William Kentridge. And this particular project, let me get you the slideshow here. This particular project is the Triumphs and Laments woodcuts. So oftentimes artists are working on things in their primary studio practice, whether it be sculptures or paintings or installations, that they have more ideas to explore than maybe that particular piece can contain. And this is one of those examples. So the Triumphs and Laments was a site-specific installation piece that was done in Rome along the Tiber River. It's about 1/4 mile long. And the wall you're looking at there for scale is about that big. So that's an adult and a 3-year-old child at the time. So that's Jillian Ross and with her son Alec when he was about 3. And so this gives you kind of a sense of scale when you look back at what you're seeing here, that this is going on for 1/4 mile. And what this is a travertine wall in the center of Rome that is blackened with just the soot and grime of city life, just automobile exhaust and just factory exhaust and heating soot and all that stuff. And it blackens these walls over time. The wall itself is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, so nothing could actually be done to it. So you couldn't actually fix anything to it, drill anything to it, do anything at all to it other than clean it, which is what was done in this case. And so William wanted to do something that really talked about and spoke to the history of the city of Rome. And he was really inspired by Montagna's epic paintings, the Triumphs of Caesar, which were about Caesar's victories in the Gallic Wars. And so for him, though, it wasn't about that triumph of the victor, but it was really more about the wreckage left behind and the lives of the vanquished, and how their plight and their story was always left out. As the famous line is, history is written by the victors. And so for him, what he started doing is researching the history of the city of Rome and all of its losers. And one of the things that he found was that the first Jewish ghettos created in Italy were done actually during the height of the Italian Renaissance, which was something new to him. And as a Jewish South African artist, it was a real hard thing for him to take, because he really idolized a lot of the artists of the Renaissance. And it's one of those things when you really learn that the people who were responsible for creating that great burgeoning of science and art in the Renaissance were also the people who were creating a ghetto to segregate and dehumanize and suppress a population of people of which you belong to. And so for him, he really dove into different aspects of the history of the city and really wanted to have the figures that you see in this long procession, or this triumphal procession, which is what's depicted in Montagna's Triumphs of Caesar paintings, that these are the people who lost. And it's a way of trying to help those stories come out so that there is a form of recognition and a form of potential reckoning or healing that can occur. And one of the things that he really wanted to speak about as well is that this was going to be an ephemeral piece. So in order for these to be made, what he did was large-scale drawings. Those drawings were scanned and translated into stencils. So what you see in the background are actually stencils cut from basically a fancy heavy-grade plastic that would be suspended over the wall and power washed. So the wall is cleaned everywhere those figures were not. That's how those pieces, the figures, were made along the wall. And so what William was doing at this time is he's spending all this time creating this work and does this giant performance piece, knowing that within what he estimated what was going to be about 7 years, the piece would disappear. It would go back to black. So all of this story, metaphorically and physically, would go away again, just so much as the histories of the vanquished are erased. So this particular drawing here, you see, is an ink wash drawing, became the center piece of a portion of the procession of the wall. And for him, this is that which I do not remember. For him, represented the generational traumas that people carry even in their DNA of things that have happened to the generations that preceded them, not necessarily to them, but how that still affects your lives moving forward. It's this big black box that's needed to be unpacked, but you're just hauling it around. And so after the site-specific piece was done, he approached Gillian Ross and David Crute. So David Crute's the longtime publisher of William Kentridge's prints. He's been publishing many series of prints that you may be familiar with, like The Nose, which related to his opera piece that he did, as well as the Universal Archive, which is a massive suite of lino cuts. And so when he was thinking about continuing this thought of the project, because initially, it's an ephemeral piece, it's going to go away, and there were parts of it that he wanted to be able to remain. He approached Jill about doing some works. And so these are some shots of the studio, the David Crute workshop, where Jill has been the master printer and studio manager for about 12 years now. And you get kind of a sense of the scale of these works and the scale of the workshop. So they started working together to figure out how to do these. And one of my favorite little points about this project is that William was originally thinking of these as images that might be 30 by 40 inches. And Jill, having seen the site-specific piece in person herself, basically told him that you can't make these small. They need to fit the scale of a large interior space, just like they fit the scale of a large exterior space. And so what they decided to do was take some of his initial ink wash drawings and project them at large format on the wall and start to trace them out to kind of find the image. And William used a series of small sketches to start to break up the images into parts, which are represented by the different pieces of paper you see pinned up to the wall. And so the map is then created on how these things will go back together. And then there's this other layer of complexity that occurred, which is creating the base wood blocks to carve these images from out of multiple types of wood. And the reason is each of these grain patterns has a different aesthetic effect. So William really likes more open grain for something that would be a face, so he can get higher contrasts and he can move things around. Some tighter grain for patterns, say on clothing or backgrounds. And so these blocks were created in this format because the images were so big they couldn't be printed on a single press. And so what they decided to do is, make multiple blocks to print multiple sheets of paper to be tiled together. But now we're talking 6 images that are all monumental scale with anywhere from 12 to 35 blocks a piece. And so in order to produce these, many hands were required to cut them. So those mylar tracings were then broken up into block by block pieces, transferred to the blocks. They were then cut, and they were cut as a group. Kind of think about a round robin session. So one person would be working on a block for about 10 minutes, and then everybody would just swap blocks with somebody else and continue cutting the next block. So that way, every single block was cut by multiple hands. So there was no one aesthetic to the block. So the pieces had a more unified piece, because the way in which someone cuts is very much like your own handwriting. It has a signature effect and aesthetic to it. So this way it ensured that all of the pieces had continuity to them, even though carvers may be coming and going, because this is a project that has taken about 5 years to complete. So the printer you see here working is Smongaseni Kulu, who's one of the master printers at David Crute's workshop, and he was working on inking up this particular block. He's working with Chad Cordeo, who's also another master printer at the studio. And so you can see they're pulling these shaped blocks and pieces, checking for color quality, because they're also pulling proofs of lighter and darker impressions. So William would have options when it came to how heavy a particular section of the print would be. And then William came in and started working on helping trim things out, and they lay things out based on the initial map. And he would sometimes find areas that he wanted to adjust a little bit. He wanted to see how some wood grain would work. So he'd take a section of some carved out wood grain and start to apply that. And what you see here is an image. This is the image of Lampedusa coming together, and they're putting it together in 2 different formats. Sometimes they would carve 2 blocks for the figure, so he would have different options on how that figure could look. And so what he was doing is he starts piecing them together, and you notice he's using push pins to do this. And this really comes from William's tradition in theater and puppetry. And he really sees, the joints of the human body reflected in the joints of a puppet. And by putting the push pins in and strategic places, it allows him to shift and adjust pieces of paper to change the intention of the figures represented, or the mood or the emotive quality of that. And so here, when you can see him comparing 2 slightly different versions where there are subtle differences between these 2 in specific areas of the print, and he's trying to figure out just what he's responding to positively. And this is where that map that was initially used to create the image is basically tossed out. And now everything is based on the parts and pieces you have, adjusting them, adding things, taking things away in order to get to a final image. Just to give you a sense of what it took to make that, these are the pieces of paper that it took to combine to make Lampedusa, which was the first in the series. So then from a production process, you have to print these over and over and over and over. You do your quality checks, you end up with all of these cutoffs because you got to cut and trim everything out. And then there's all the order of things. It's not just one piece of paper on top in one spot. So maybe over in one area, under in another, which involves, a lot of post-production just from the printing stage in order to edition one of these pieces. So the studio has these big periods of time there in Johannesburg where there's just dedicated solely to production on one of these prints. This gives you a kind of a close-up of the feel of one of the surfaces of those. So now that was just, Lampedusa was just one. And so what I'll show you here is the making of Montagna, which, really has that procession element of it in there. And you can see Jill and William spent a lot of time talking with one another, figuring out not just the subtleties of things, but how, when you adjust something, it changed the conceptual focus. So she was really present in for a lot of those conversations and helping William figure those things out. You can start to see how the prints are coming together and parts and pieces that are changing, and here being a state just before the final. And something of note here is just how different parts of the print actually change from this scene to this image. There's subtle things. Like one of the major things is how much white area. That's why I keep flipping back and forth. It's like how much white area there is around the figures, how that increases to create a larger pop in certain places to adjust the graphic flow. And so as they were working on all the prints in the series, they were experimenting with slightly different things. So here you can see like the greater effect of the wood grain and the blocks that they're working on right there. Lining things up and then also throwing things askew. And this is a really great example of how there was 2 different blocks carved for the central figure. It's how, they would always carve on one block overlapping significantly into the area of another block. So you had an option of putting something over or putting something under, changing the grain, cutting a piece of it off. So that way he could vary it to the largest extent. And so for William, he's super present in the studio when it came time to start putting things together, and then everybody has to start printing things differently or carving more things out of the blocks to where you get to your final state here for the flood. Each of these prints required a lot of people. It has taken 18 different people, almost a total of 5 years in order to complete this suite of 6 images. So you kind of get a sense of the time commitment from a printing as well as a publishing perspective, because it's, you're outputting all that cash to keep the studio going, pay all your staff before you really have the final product to show people. These were the last 2 images, The Refugees, God's Opinion is Unknown, and Leaning on Air. And my personal favorite print out of the series is that which I do not remember. It's the giant black box. And for me, this was one of those moments where, for William, the image came about on the site-specific piece because there was a miscalculation of the length of that wall by a small amount. And there was a gap in what he had planned out. And so he had to come up with, like, what do I fill this gap with? And, he often talks about that the real beauty in art making doesn't occur with what you've planned, but occurs with how you deal with the problems that arise and the interjections of the rest of the world into the work that you respond to. And this was one of those cases. And this particular image came out of having to solve one of those problems. And for me, the scale of this, it's, it's 82, almost 82 and a half, about 82 and a half inches tall. So it's almost a 7-foot tall print. So when you think about that from a scale perspective, just the weight of this big black box, it's something quite amazing. And now, in order to sign these things and make these things, they basically have to put them all together, pre-pin them all, make sure everything works, and if there's consistency across. So they're always constantly putting up a piece next to their BAT, which makes it possible for William to come in and sign these. So it's a big production. On one side, it means that you can break the print down into smaller pieces of paper and pack that for shipment. And this is an idea that was borrowed in many ways from Albrecht Dürer and the Triumphal Arch. And one of the more interesting aspects about the process of relief printing is how little it has changed on a basic level since Dürer's time. We think the Triumphal Arch was completed in 1515. Dürer was he was the primary designer of this particular work, but there were other artists also involved. And this print was made for the glorification of Emperor Maximilian. That's what it was all about. So this really fits in line with Montaigne's Triumphs of Caesar. And, this print is, it's about 11 feet tall. It's considered the biggest print made. And it's was made with, as you can see, there are 195 blocks on 36 sheets of paper. It was intended to be tiled. So the purpose of the printing of the Triumphal Arch was that it was made, it could be packaged up in something small and shipped out and put into different municipal buildings in different cities across the empire. So this could be literally wheat pasted to the wall and then hand colored, so that at every place across Maximilian's reign, they would have this image, because this was an image dedicated to the glorification of his family and his lineage to help ensure his family line's reign of power over the empire at that time. And so when you think about Albrecht Dürer's Triumphal Arch in comparison to William Kentridge's Triumphs and Laments, it's the two opposite ends of the spectrum of why someone is making the work. One is the glorification of the victor, and one is, the upwelling and the uprising and the giving voice to the vanquished. They're both being done in the same processes, similar monumental scales, tiling up those works so that we can actually have those things present in conversation with one another today. And so for me, that way that printmaking can allow these sorts of cross centuries conversations to occur is one of the more important reasons that we have printmaking in our lives. I'm going to switch gears now to just show you a little bit of what's going on in my studio, and we can get back to. It's kind of keeping in the woodcut frame here. I'll skip ahead a little bit. It's a project I'm working on with artist Lynn Myers. She's a DC-based artist. She's known for site-specific installation pieces in museums. One of her more recent major pieces was at the Hirshhorn. It was a wall drawing that took about 2.5 months to make and was up for a year. But as many artists have had to shift a lot of their practice during the COVID era. When she went into quarantine, she took this book with her from her studio to start working more at home. That was Turner and Ruskin's 2-volume set. It was Ruskin's text that was this kind of passionate defense of Turner's paintings from 1900. It was a first edition volume. And she started cutting it away. She's had this book since she was a student at Cooper Union. So she's been carrying it around for about 34 years, this volume set. And she hadn't really known what to do with it. And so when she was thinking about what to take from her studio, she's thinking of small things, and she just said, you know what, I'm taking these with me. And what she realized in looking at these is that these words and these works have been super impactful for her over her life. And what she needed to do was distill them down to the most important elements of those. So she started just cutting off all of the words to find these beautiful moments or things that were reflective of our time within those. And the negative spaces that were left then started to inform a drawing practice. She's always had this consistent drawing practice of drawing on graph paper, which led us to then talking about making some prints that related to these text reduction pieces. And what you see here is an image on the right that is drawn from that exact same format, where the negative space becomes the positive image, the space around the sheet becomes a border. And so all of the woodcut elements are the elements that are not the actual paper. So the paper is the paper in this case. And the scale is the exact same. So the negative void on the print, the woodcut there, is the same scale as her text reduction piece. So it's a 1-to-1 scale. And so we made these into a small suite. So we did a quick round of printing. She was the first artist I've been able to have in my studio since I set this one up here in Asheville because of COVID. And, COVID has really changed the ways in which we work with artists now. It's made it much more difficult. Printmaking is so much about being together and working together to solve our problems. And it's a really difficult thing to do by distance. So finally, we were just like, you just need to come. She got a negative COVID test. We masked up and we just worked in the studio in that way, keeping our distance as best we could. I'll show you this little image because I wanted to this little video. This is one that Lynn took of me pulling a proof of one of the prints. These are 3-color woodcuts. This is putting the last color on this particular one. So I wanted to, just point out that these are woodcuts, but we didn't cut any wood. And so for the print geeks out there, what we were really focused on was allowing her to have flexibility within the image. So if she needed to move something up 1/4 inch or over 1/8 of an inch, or expand an opening a little bit, or close it down by 1/16, we could. Because if I had carved all the blocks, we wouldn't really be able to do that. And because, the wood's gone. And so in this case, what I did was made stencils based off of her text reduction pieces that allowed us to then ink up oak veneered sheets of plywood and drop the stencils down and then print those off onto the sheets of paper. So it allowed us this great deal of flexibility and variability. And then in talking with her in studio, one of the things I had asked her, said, well, do you want me to cut these blocks now? Would you like to cut these blocks now? Or do you want this piece of paper to remain perfectly flat? Because if you cut the wood away, when you go to print it, you're going to get a small embossment when you run it through on an etching press from the areas where you cut it, which will affect the sheet. And what she really fell in love with was the flatness of the sheet, the graphic nature of it. And she didn't really want to start affecting that level of physicality by embossing, having that paper move around. So we're going to go ahead and approach these in the printing in the exact same way. So for me, one of the things that, I work on with as a collaborating printer is trying to find ways in which I can work with my artists to help them realize their vision in a way that they couldn't do on their own. So the first question I ask an artist when we go into studio is, if you can do it in your studio, do it in your studio. Bring the problems that you can't solve into the print shop. Those are things that'll be interesting for you, interesting for us. And so I always ask them, what are the things that aren't working in your studio? Show me the things that haven't worked out. And let's start there. Let's have our conversation there. So, the book, obviously it's a book on printmaking. So I made a few prints to accompany some special editions. This is one I did with artist Glenn Baldridge, who also has a feature of a project that he did, that he and I did, a photogravure project in the book as well. This is a 2-color screen print with some silver foil. And I also did a lithograph that's hand toned in the tradition of early hand toned lithographs in the, around the 1820s, 1830s of an image as well. So for me, this is the book. This is where a lot of all this stuff is coming out. It's available. If you guys are interested in different things from me as far as prints projects and artists that I'm working with and things that are going on, you can follow along on Instagram. I'm always posting stuff and doing live Q&As. Something that's coming up, if you're really loving the print geek and the technical side behind things, or the history behind some of our processes that we use, how the industrial art goes towards the creative arts. I'll also be doing a book club starting in the middle of January, the second week of January, where it really dives into more of the backgrounds of these projects, as well as bringing in guest speakers, guest artists and printers and things like that. And on Instagram, I do a lot of Instagram live conversations with different publishers and printers across the US and outside the US to really kind of showcase what's going on in their studios as well. So if you're interested in really knowing what's going on in contemporary printmaking, just kind of follow along. So I'll stop my monologue at this point and open up for questions, because I'd really love to hear what you guys are thinking about things right now. So if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to shout them out.
I'll jump in really quick. If anybody has questions, you can put them in the chat and I can read them. And yeah, I have a question to ask to start,
Sure.
and I'll read other questions. So what advice can you offer to current students or recently graduated students in print who want to pursue a career as a collaborative printer?
Ooh, that's a big one. It's a tough industry. I'm gonna be really honest with everybody right now. It's not a stable job, so to speak, because our industry is so dependent on the fickle nature of the art market. And prints, from a price point perspective, are lower down than, say, paintings or sculptures and things like that. And so if there's a dip in the art market, prints take that hit first. And so, one of the reasons I started doing printer training when I was the director of the Robert Blackburn printmaking workshop was because of the crash of the art market in the 90s, in the early, like 1989 into the early 90s. And then the subsequent one again that happened around September 11th really meant that a lot of the big publishing shops didn't take on new printers. They couldn't afford to. And so there's kind of this missing generation of printers. There aren't very many of us that are in, like, that's my age bracket. There's a couple, and there's even fewer of us there's only a handful of us that are what are referred to as multi-process printers, meaning we do all the processes and can combine them all. And so as a result, a lot of the print shops are actually on harder times when it comes to having staff to hire, but that doesn't necessarily mean they've opened it up for hiring more people. So my advice is, if it's something that you're interested in, the first thing you need to do is go work in a shop. You need to understand what the day in and day out grind, and I'm going to call it that because a lot of it is a grind in a print shop. I mean, whether you're literally grinding a litho stone or just running editions, because in order to really kind of gain enough experience to be an effective collaborative printer, you do need a certain amount of time on the press, just time literally spent editioning other people's work. And so when I used to teach printmaking and university, I taught at SF State and at Stanford. The first thing I would always have my students do is match a print that I had created. So like in an Intaglio class, I'd make a couple different plates. I'd pull a proof of those, and you had to learn how to match them, because it's learning to print someone else's work is a really different skill set than learning to print your own, because there's no forgiveness. It's like an artist makes something, that's what they want. It can't be like, oh, I like this happy accident, maybe I'll go with that, like you might do for your own art. There is zero tolerance for that. You need to produce what has been asked of you, and it needs to be right. And there's a very high bar of quality that you have to shoot for. So if your personality is such that you enjoy that challenge, you enjoy a certain amount of the unknown, then it's a process and a job that you can kind of go towards, because there's going to be a lot of that. I mean, I think James Sienna said to me once, he's like, the printers that I like the most are the ones that always tell me, when I ask them, can I do that? They always say yes. And he's like, and I know that they don't know how to do it. He's like, but by the morning, they've figured it out. Like, and that's really, it's got to be part of your DNA as a person to basically be like, yes. It's like hard for you to say no, and you're going to just push and experiment, because there's this point where you have to be able to get and the realization that you're never going to know enough. And that's a good thing. Like, because you're always going to be pushing something new because of the artist you're working with. So for young people, the most important thing you can do is time on press, work with the most number of printers and work under the most number of printers that you possibly can, and work specifically for artists that you don't resonate necessarily with their work aesthetically. Doesn't mean you don't like it, but it's just not what you would do. Right. So that way there's not that early temptation to fulfill your own creative artistic desires through someone else's work, but to really learn how to help someone else fulfill theirs. So, and that's what's going to make you an effective collaborator over time, is being able to separate what I would do for me personally as an artist versus what I need to help you do for you as an artist. And that's really what reduces frustration from a collaborative printing sense and keeps you active and excited, because the printers who get burned out real early are the ones who would rather be the artist. And, so they're really two different jobs, from a collaborative printing perspective. And so what I try to help young people learn early on in the printing process is that they have a great responsibility and a very special role for an artist to let you into their own personal creative space comes with a great deal of responsibility. That's a space they don't really let many people into at all. The spouses don't go there. Like, no one else goes. That's their private space. But in order for you to help them with the work, they got to be willing to let you into that spot, and you have to be mindful of that and really, understand that that's a very privileged perspective to get to see the world through their eyes, like truly through their eyes, to help them make their work. So you have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to check your ego at the door. Know that unless someone like myself comes along and writes a big book, your name is never going to be in print. No one's going to know you participated in it. If you want credit or recognition, definitely not the job for you, because you're just never going to get it. That's not why you do it. So like one of the comments about the book that people say is like, I can't believe how big the captions are. It's because there's a lot of information that I think people want to know, but you don't normally get. Like, I go to a show at the Museum of Modern Art, and they don't even put, like, there's the Charles White show. They didn't even put on there that Bob Blackburn printed the portrait of John Brown, which that alone, I mean, Charles White, as an African-American man, only painted or drew images of two white people, John Brown, the abolitionist John Brown, and Abraham Lincoln. And it's really important to know that in 1948, a black artist, black social realist artist, Army vet, worked with the only printer that would print that image at the precursor of the civil rights movement. I mean, we're talking about the guy who was like, let's arm the slaves, full violent insurrection. And he was basically to put that image up there, an image of John Brown in 1948. You can kind of understand that the average white person would not have printed that. So that being printed by Bob Blackburn as an African-American man, and the fact that no one really knows how many were printed, we all know that a ton of those impressions were printed and they were disseminated around. But that was a really important moment from a point of social justice and social change in the United States. And so the fact that they didn't even put Bob's name on the wall, on the card, or describe anything that related to that particular image will tell you how much is just missing from the general conversation about the works that we see. So for me, that image is in this book, and it's clearly stated as what its purpose was, because it was printmaking really has that ability, but the stories behind and the printers do add to it, even though those stories are not often told. So I say to young people, it's like, it's important that the work that you're doing, but it's not, you have to know why you're doing it. It's really about the art first. It's not about any of those other things. So if you're really thinking, should I be an artist? Should I be a printer? If you're really having that conversation, $10 says you're an artist. So, you're going to spend some time in a print shop, and, you start, doing it like you're wiping the same plate for 2 months, because it's a complicated project. And if you're still like, I love printmaking after that, then you got a chance as a printer. It's probably the longest answer I've ever given to that question, but, there you go.
No, thank you. That was very informative and helpful. There's a question in the chat. I'll read it for you. What is the edition size of the Kentridge prints? Were they all collaged together or Shinkleed?
I wouldn't even call them collage. They're literally pinned together. So those are all separate pieces of paper that remain separate. They're editions of 12 plus proofs. So on some of them, you're looking at like 36 pieces of paper to make one print. Now you multiply that times 12 times a whole bunch of proofs, printers proofs, artist proofs, shop impressions, and things like that. You're dealing with a lot of pieces of paper and a lot of blocks. And then there's all that time, production time of trimming everything. So some of them have torn edges, some of them have cut edges. Just depends on where they are in the image and how they overlap. So any one of those prints can take upwards of 4 months, 5 months to edition. So when you're thinking about like, okay, I need to print, say you need, I think in this case, I think they needed like 24 complete images. So you're going to have to print likely somewhere in the ballpark of like 30 to 35, because you need, there's, a hair falls on a block, there's a hickey in the ink, someone tears one incorrectly, you need some backups, all those types of things. So you're going to print about 35 per piece of paper. So you're doing 35 times 36 separate pieces of paper for one image. And the blocks are big because it's a massive print. You print on 30 by 40 inch sheets of paper, things like that. So you can kind of understand like the time commitment that comes to that. So yeah, so they're not even, I wouldn't even call them collage. There's no adhesive used whatsoever for those. They're literally push binned. They're push binned into, I think it's like a 4-ply museum board is how they do them. So.
Thank you. I'm not sure. I don't think anyone has any other questions. I have a couple more.
Sure.
Maybe can you speak a little bit more about kind of navigating your role as a collaborative printer and then your role as an artist, and maybe how those two overlap and conflicts, or yeah.
I mean, it's kind of pretty cut and dry. I don't generally make prints. I mean, that's like my day job, so, and I respect the role of collaboration kind of too much. And as someone who has a lot of printing experience, what I've found is that I pre-problem solve out the creative problems that really make work interesting. So when you're working, you're like come up with against a roadblock. As a printer, you kind of like you set too much up, and you've reduced a quantity of problems. So the only time I make prints is when I do them in collaboration with another printer. So I can just stay in artist brain versus switching into printer brain. Does that make sense on that? And so I make a lot of sculpture and I make a lot of artist books. It's for my own personal work. So it's so that I have some separation there, and I can, because for me it's, you print this much and for this long, it's a lot of fun to draw lithostone and things like that. But the likelihood of me doing like a 20 color litho for myself is pretty low. If someone else is going to do the printing, okay, I'll draw the 20 colors. But it's just that amount of time for me to spend on a singular image, to produce it at that level. I'd rather make more work. Does that make sense? So, and I just have a lot of respect for the collaborative process, and I know what that can do for the work and someone else's perspective of asking you questions like, well, why do you want it like that? Or do you want it over here? Or do you want to shift it in this way? That those are the things that really help the work gain some additional life and additional push and movement. So for me, I haven't made the one for the book is like the first one I've printed for myself, and I want to say like 12 years or something, a long time. Normally I'm working with somebody else. So.
Thank you. That's nice to have that separation. I feel like there's another question in the chat. It says, where did the underwriting come from for the large project?
Which one, the Kentridge project?
I'm assuming that's what is being referred to.
Yeah, David Kroot, he's the publisher of that. It was his workshop in Johannesburg. So he's the one who put up the cash for 5 years in order to make that thing happen. And one of the things that I talk about in the book too, and is the amount of faith that a publisher has to have in the artist and in their work, because they have to put their money up front first to produce a project. So if you're an artist, you do some paintings, approach a gallery, the gallery can say, sure, I'll throw those paintings up on the wall in August when no one's going to be here. We'll see if we can sell any of those things. It's no sweat off their back. It's a month that they were going to write off anyway. And you've had to pay to produce all your paintings, right? So their overhead is covered on other things. If you're a print publisher, on the other hand, you have to put all your money up front first, because you have to make that work. You have to pay to make it. You have to get it all done in a timely fashion so that you can start marketing it and then try to turn around and be able to sell it in order to recuperate your cost of production, the money that you've put in first, and then in order to make something profitable for the artist and for yourself. So the faith that a print publisher has to have in an artist is so much higher, because your money is involved up front. And so whenever you see an artist being published, it's really someone, especially if it's an artist you don't know, it's someone you really want to think about well, there must be something about this person if someone's willing to put their money up front first. There's something here. So maybe you don't get the work, don't like the work, but you're like, why is someone putting effort into this? I generally encourage you to look into that artist's work, because that's someone's willing to put that level of faith in, to put their money behind it. And so, publishers have a really hard job. They're trying to make something that fulfills the artist's vision, but is also profitable to keep their people employed, to keep that workshop going, and to make it possible for that artist to continue to make prints. So it's a really delicate balance of how involved a publisher is relative to the artwork itself. Some publishers are so involved that artists are like, I'm never working with you again. You're telling me I can't make this yellow. And then other publishers are really just there for like psychological support. They're like, okay, everybody, we can finish this project, right? We can keep this thing going. We can eventually get it across the finish line. So we can, I say there's a Julie Merritt print in the book, and she's a great example, because people look at these giant etchings that she's been doing out of Gemini in LA, and they're beautiful. And Julie's an awesome person, and they look at the price tag on that, and they see that they sell out, and they think they're just making tons of money. But when you're like, it took 5 people like a year and a half to produce that image and to get it out to where the money could actually start coming in. Gemini had to float 5 salaries, all the overhead of that production of the facility and the material for something of that scale. Like, you're looking at just, the copper in and of itself probably cost 20 grand just to buy the copper. And so, so when you think about all that they have to put in the hopes that it gets finished, and then that people want it, and that by the time it's released into the world, it's not like a massive economic calamity like we're in right now, to where no one's going to buy it. Like, everybody wanted it, everybody reserved it, and all of a sudden, like, I don't have any money anymore. The economy tanked, and you just put in years worth of money and effort, and now you got to wait. And then the fashion passes, and maybe that artist isn't as famous anymore. So there's a great deal of faith that is put in order to produce projects. So yeah, David Crute has, he's been working with William for 30 years now. And he's the person who really helped promote William's work in the United States. And they have a really long, close-knit relationship. They understand one another really well. And so for David, he was like, all right, this is a crazy project. It's a prints that, like, when you put them all on a wall, take up like 125 feet across a wall. When you actually space them all out and you put them out, they're just these massive things. And you're like, this is this huge body of work. And then you realize, oh, my gallery door in New York City, like, the prints are too big to even go in. So I'm gonna have to like tear out a wall, just put in a bigger door, so that just my gallery can actually have these prints in them. So there's all these ancillary things, because it all came down to, I believe in this artist, I believe in their vision, and we need to see it all the way through. So there's a great deal of faith that's required on behalf of publishers, and printers too. And so a lot of times the printers are also the publishers, which is kind of a double whammy, because you also have all your sweat equity in there as well. So if it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. So don't be so harsh on all your big time publishers out there. It's not so easy for them either. They got a lot of mouths to feed. So
yeah, I got a quick question for you, Phil.
Sure.
I feel like we're kind of at a crossroads with, now that you mentioned the big publishers, there's a lot of them that are on the verge of retiring.
Yep.
Questioning whether they're going to hand off the studio to the new printers. We have a market that's changing. Not sure kind of what's going to happen with the opening back up after the pandemic.
Right.
As well as just kind of a shift in the gallery system. I think about Marlborough closing and what that meant and how that happened. And
right.
kind of like, how do you see this moving forward in the next 10, 20 years? What do you see? Because I know you're, more than many, you're connected in a way that a lot of others don't see it. So I'm just curious, like, what do you see coming up?
There's going to be a lot of equipment coming on the market. So, and the reason, I use this anecdote to kind of describe the main problem we have in the industry. And it's, Jasper Johns' False Start, considered the first painting reprints. It's made in 1962, I believe. It's sold, its initial offering price, its pre-publication price was $350. And when it was, I believe the final sellout price of that print in like 1963 or 64, when it sold out, was $550. Now, Jasper Johns at that time was not Jasper Johns of today. right? He was a young artist, had a lot of promise, had very little record of sale of his work, but had, you know, a lot of good connections and a lot of movement behind him. We can think of a lot of younger artists or mid-career artists even at that same stage today where he was at, and that's the same price we can get for a print today. But a publisher wouldn't do an 11 color lithograph with someone because they could only get $550 for it, right? So you're going to get a 2 color lithograph and everybody's going to cross their fingers and hope they can move it, right? So the problem is that our cost of production has gone through the roof relative to the costs of what we can actually get for prints. And it has to do with a conceptual divide of what people think a print is worth. And it has to do with which generations of people are buying prints. And so the vast majority of people who've been keeping the price suppressed are much, much older print collectors who are like, well, that print's too expensive. And you're like, do you realize how much it costs to make this damn thing? It's like, it needs to be more. And people are constantly asking for that discount, constantly asking for it to be a cheaper price. And you're like, no, it shouldn't be. But what you're seeing now is that artists' prices are adjusting extraordinarily high. So that means the pricing of the prints need to go with that in order for us to have a market that moves forward. So one of the things I keep encouraging people to do is double the prices on your prints. And they're like, but I'm never going to sell it. I'm like, you're not going to know unless you try. And I can guarantee you right now, if you sell it for that other price, you're not going to be in business in 10 years. Like, you need to move that price point up. It needs to be reflective of the reality of the time we're in. So when you see someone like Jonas Wood selling screen prints for $60,000, right? Because he's with Gagosian, who figured out that, well, the prints are just the wrong price. They should be more expensive. The paintings are crazy expensive, so the prints shouldn't be a $5,000 print. That's not a $5,000 market. It's a $60,000 market, right? And so what we have to have is a massive shift in pricing, which I know a lot of young people out there are like, well, I'm like, no print should be selling for less than $1,500, period. Like, this big, little tiny etching, that should be $1,500 as a start point, like for a relatively unknown artist, because of the amount of overhead it takes to make that today. This, when you factor in, a piece of paper is going to cost you $8. It's like, a piece of copper is going to cost you $10. You haven't gotten into ink, you haven't gotten into overhead of a studio. And so unless those prices adjust, all you're going to see are just the top tier blue chip artists being published, because it's the only thing anyone can afford to do. You can only do Jasper Johns and Richard Serra, and because the price point at which you can receive back for those works can cover the overhead of what it actually costs to produce those things. And so the math really for a lot of these shops that may end up retiring out is just that, do we just sell our back inventory for the next 2 generations because we've got a lot of great work that we still have? Or do we really invest knowing that we're going to have to ride out the next 10 years of deflated pricing until we can work as a group to raise the pricing to something that is a living wage? So, everyone talks about a living wage for someone working at McDonald's. Well, it's the same thing for an artist. If an artist still can't sell a painting for more than $10,000, they're not going to eat. And so, I'm facing that difficulty personally with myself in my own studio, which is, there's work that I would like to be doing. There's artists that I would like to print with, but economically, it just doesn't work out because I can't sell a print for that much yet. And so one of the things that I'm concerned with that may have to happen is essentially a complete collapse of our industry in order to restart it from scratch, bring it back in at this new point and new price level. So I'm hoping we don't have to have that happen in order to adjust the sightlines. I mean, when I go out and I talk to collectors, one of the first things I tell them that every time you ask for that 10% discount, you're guaranteeing that artist is less likely to be able to continue being an artist, because you're taking it from them. Your deal is decreasing your long-term financial return on that work because they're less likely to become an artist, to stay doing that, because they won't be able to feed their family. Every time you take that 10%, because the prices are already low, they've already discounted it. It's the cost of making work is just so high. So as an industry, where I see it surviving is actually in university settings. Where I see the bridge for the marketplace is actually with, essentially subsidized print shops. So, Flying Horse Editions in Orlando, I've spent a lot of time training staff there and helping that organization build and get going. So they can be one of the places that can bridge this. There's Tamarind, there's Graphic Studios, there's Tandem. So when you start thinking about all the university-based presses, those are the ones that can weather just about anything because there is a certain level of subsidy because they're partnered with a university. So any of the independent operators, they have a much more difficult rubric to figure out and to work with than your average other person would. So an artist printmaker is already disadvantaged because people like myself who are producing these insanely difficult to make beautiful things that you see in the museum, they don't have access to the technical knowledge or even the resources to produce those things. And so there's this big gulf between like student prints or printmaker prints and what's coming out of professional workshops. And it has to do with lack of access to information and how you do it and lack of like hands and expertise to get there. It's not that someone couldn't make that work. It's just that that costs so much that you can't expect an individual printmaker to be able to afford to do that, right? So what we've done in our industry is we've kind of raised the bar so high that we've actually made it difficult for us to survive unless the prices can come up to that bar of quality. So it's a really difficult, we're at a very difficult point. Like COVID was not helpful. Like, cause it's essentially it's like the Hurricane Sandy, what it did to galleries in New York City. It was like well, got my insurance payout, so I could just close up shop. And all of a sudden all these mid-career galleries were gone, like overnight. Because they're like, what is my future in this super big luxury brands art world? So, so we're facing that right now. So my hope is that, one of the reasons of writing this book was to start to educate an audience, was to really start thinking about what is the value of this work from a cultural perspective. Like, why do we need to make prints? And it really has to do with making sure there's a physical record of how we see the world today, so that future generations can better understand who they are because they know who we were, right? And because so much of like this conversation we have right now, it's being recorded, it's going to be put up on the web. It will probably not be added to the next version of whatever digital media and digital content is, which means this will go away, right? It's not forever. Everybody thinks everything is on the web's forever. It's like, nope, it's what people are willing to convert to the next format is what lasts. And this conversation, my humble opinion, it's not going to rise to the top. So, I know who I am, it's, so when you think about it in those terms, the physical record that we leave are the things that will persist, and by making them in multiple, like a printed edition, it has a chance of surviving because it's been disseminated, right? And so that's why we have Durer's Triumphal Arch still. So many of those were wheat pasted up onto walls, but so many of them just never got put up. They were just in a stack in some monastery waiting to go up, and no one put it up. So but they're in dozens of monasteries, and that's why you can have a copy of it in the British Museum. You can show one over at Yale and things like that. So I encourage people to print, because it's really important for your voice to be multiplied in that way. To value your own voice enough to multiply it. And to be specific enough in what it is that you have to say, to know that that is worth saying over and over and over, and to leave that record. But, we're going to be, we're staring down a difficult time. So if y'all are going to set up the most amazing publishing shop ever, now's the time. So there'll be people, there'll be people to employ, and, because I do see a contraction in our market coming. So print dealers, they're fine because they get to deal with, 1,350 years of printed material. But it's the print publishers, it's the contemporary print publishers that are really getting ready to be in a serious pinch. That's the reality of it. It comes down to cash. So I know a lot of good printers who aren't printing anymore because of that. Not because they don't want to. It's because can't afford it.
Yeah,
Don't mean to be depressing, guys.
Just a quick follow-up. It's something that I've discussed with many professional print shops, is kind of this ethical dilemma of being subsidized as a college university shop, and what that means. And maybe this is the time that ethics go out the door and we're actually now supporting the process. But I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Because I've always, I like Maurice and Serious Editions and other places that I've been in contact with for years, like there's always this kind of somewhat shaming of like, you get a free building and you're getting supported by the university and you're taking our business away. And
Sour grapes.
yeah.
That's what
Okay.
it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to have that too. You know, I would love to have what I do under the umbrella of the university.
Okay.
I have actually tried, you know, and it's been really, really close to
Yeah.
getting it over the finish line. It was like an issue with a chancellor that caused mine not going to a university to be under that umbrella. And the reason I say that is, you know, if you're wanting to do anything that is financially risky because it's about the art first, you really have to have a deep pocketed financial backer in order to do that in this climate. It's just too expensive to operate. You know, one of the reasons I'm in Asheville is because it's too expensive to operate in New York City. Right? I mean, galleries are being pushed out so that Target can have a design studio in Chelsea, right? Because they walk in and they say, like Betty Cunningham, she lost her space in Chelsea. It was one, you know, a storied gallery. She's an amazing art dealer. She's a great human being. Lost her gallery space in Chelsea because Target came in and said, well, we'll pay 3, 4, 5, 10 times whatever she's paying. We don't care. We want the space. And the landlord's like, bye, Betty. You know, and I mean, that's the market that we're all trying to operate in. And so it's not going to survive in the same way that it has. It has to be reinvented. And, you know, so the hard part is, you know, for someone like Maurice, who's busted his ass his whole life, he's done a lot of amazing work, you know, yeah, the system is stacked against him. It's stacked against people like me as well. You know, so unless you've got this inventory of back Jasper Johns prints that you can sell in the lean times to keep your staff employed, like you don't, the math doesn't work for you. And so for me, I think it's super important that the university systems take the resources they have in order to provide opportunities, not just for young people to be able to develop a career, but for artists to be able to have opportunities that wouldn't otherwise have it. You know, there's so many artists of color, you know, LGBTQ artists, you know, Native American artists. The reason their work got out there is because of prints, and their print careers generally started in some of these university shops, right? It's because they got a chance to get their voice out there because the prints actually put them out there and put them in context with other artists. And so it's super critical at helping to change who has access to being printed as artists, you know. So, you know, it was a difficult thing for me with the book, but it was a dedicated effort to diversify the artists represented as most as I could. But I was also having to work with prints that were published, right? So I had to rely on, they had to, one, have been published in order for me to be able to, it's really just a logistical thing in order to get enough, you know, work, because it's like you go to the publisher has, and I'm say getting 5 images from that particular publisher, I had one set of rights releases that I have to have versus now 5, right? And it was just a logistical nightmare to try to get, you know, 100 different rights releases from the 102 contemporary artists that are in the book, when I could go to 33 publishers, right? So that's, you know, so some of what I decided to do is like, well, I want to talk about this relationship of the artist, the printer, and the publisher. And I can go here and then I can curate from what they've curated, you know, the most diverse set of voices possible to really try to help steering that conversation. So that was a, you know, dedicated effort on my behalf relative to, you know, art selection for the book, and like how it was presented and things like that to really try to help steer the conversation, because as a field, that's what we all want to do. And we have to try to like visually make it possible to do that. And this is kind of part of my contribution to that, to try to make it possible. Because there's, you know, a lot of artists that, you know, should have been being published so much longer ago. Like someone that I've been following for a long time is, you know, Edgar Heaper Birds. I love his work. You know, it's only just now he's starting to get any sort of press of anything. Like Marie Watt, I've loved her work for such a long time. You know, like Chakaya Booker, I've worked with for so long, you know, and it's just like just now her prints are starting to get like some sort of recognition. You know, we've been working on stuff for 12 years, you know, a dedicated body of work, you know. And so when you start thinking about, you know, things like that, these other voices, like print shops are where that happens, and the university presses are the ones that are going to make that happen. So I see that I understand why people say that, because I agree. I mean, shit, who wouldn't want to be not having to worry about your rent today? You know, I think every single one of you out there that's on this call, that's left on this, would be like, I would totally love someone else covering my rent so that I could just make my work. Right. So yeah, I get it, but it's, it's like apples to cows at that point. You just can't, that's the life you chose. You got to go with it, So.
I actually got to work with Edgar Birds at the University of Hawaii at Manoa studio. So that's a perfect example of what you're talking about. We worked through Charles Cohan was my professor, and he had Arm and Roller Press, which was he ran alongside print shop. So I think that's a great example of that.
Right. And there's a lot of those little print shops at different universities. And, that's how I got my start in collaborative printmaking. Oligarto Press at the University of Florida. So it's tiny, didn't produce that much work, but man, it had a big impact on, Matt and I. So, look at us now, So it's, it means a great deal. And, the hard part is a lot of universities are contracting in the COVID time too. And so there's a greater risk to the print institutions and these university systems as well, because they're like, well, how many dollars is this really bringing? How many students are really interacting with it? But it's not, that's such a short-sightedness, because it's also, how is that art that's being produced, they're interacting with the rest of the world? What is the cultural value of the work that's been produced and its impact for the rest of the world, because it now exists, right? So there's another conversation to have, but that's not an accounting conversation, right? It's not going to translate to dollars. It's really hard to help people think about the value worth relationship when it comes to art. When you think about what is the cultural value relative to what it's worth, or how much money you're willing to part to have that cultural value, right? So in times of stress, there's like, no one's willing to pay for cultural value, but that's the time when you need to double down and invest in it more, because that's when we need it more, right? That's when we need our artists to be more present in our lives. That's when we need that, projection of who we can become on the other side of difficult times. That's really when we need our artists the most. It's in times like this. And so it's hard, for people to be like, okay, well, I guess we're going to pay for those artists right now. But the answer is yes, you should. Now is the time. So it's a really, it's a hard world for artists right now, because there is such a contraction. There are so fewer opportunities for artists to enter into the gallery system at large, because there are so fewer galleries than there were 10 years ago. The crash of 2008, Hurricane Sandy, like that cleared out so many galleries and so many opportunities. There's a lot of artists who were in those galleries who are still have no representation, had great careers going, and they're just like floating, they're in free fall, and so new artists they're coming up into this kind of glut, this backlog. So what's going to take is some people with vision to figure out new ways to get that work up and into the world, maybe with the way in which people are experiencing art differently virtually now, and people are having these types of experiences, there'll be a chance. But ultimately, at the end of the day, artists make work for it to be seen in person, not just on a screen. So like the woodcuts I showed you of Lynn's, they look okay on a screen, but they're amazing in person. Like they glow, like those center parts actually pop right off the page. And you're like, why does this do this? And you're drawn to them, and people are really, they're kind of silenced by them in person. Whereas digitally, you could just pass them by. So
I think we have a couple more questions in the chat.
Sure.
One of them is, what do you advise if we want to have a print shop that is accessible for everybody in the community?
Deep pockets. So it takes a lot of money, or it takes a lot of time and dedication. So, I ran a community-based studio in New York City. We served about 8,500 people a year, and with 4,000 square feet. So it's an insane amount of people running through that space. And how we did it was collective will. So we had anywhere between 30 to 60 volunteers working in that studio to keep it going. So because we only had 3 paid staff. So for a long time, I was the only full-time staff person. And I was working, 70 hours a week, 80 hours a week. and we had tons and tons of volunteers. So if you want a community space, it needs to be operated by the community in order for it to really be financially viable for people to be able to have time to experiment and without the fear of the overhead. So everybody really has to chip in. It's basically, the math on it is more people need to chip in if what they can chip in is less money versus, if you have somebody chipping in a ton, then fewer people need to chip in. But so how you make a space economically viable is, a mixture of things like classes and fundraisers and people working for free in exchange for time in the shop, printing for other people. Like there's this whole mixture of things that you kind of have to be willing to do in order to cover the rent and make things happen. It's because space and material are expensive, so you have to do it in an area where, I was on a panel one time a number of years ago, and there's this very kind person who was like, I want to start this nonprofit printmaking organization in this neighborhood to help these people. My first question, I was like looking at her, I was like, wow, you really don't look like anyone in that community to me, and my first question was, are you part of that community? And she was like, no. I was like, so how can you know what that community needs if you're not part of it? This, it's like, I can't purport to know what a community needs that I'm not a part of, right? So, so when I hear people want to start a community print shop, I'm like, are you part of a community that also wants this too? Because don't start it until you are. Don't start it and don't put the shingle up until there's the need for the shingle, So if you're wanting to do this, start talking to anyone and everyone else who you think might be interested in this, and really start to build that team support in order for it to happen, because it's the only way it's really going to happen. You got to, a community shop needs to be the home base for that community of people, where they would rather go there than the bar or a movie, or in a lot of ways see their own family. It's like that has to be the center of their creative lives in order for it to really take off. And so for Bob Blackburn's printmaking workshop, that was in a lot of ways the only place a lot of artists felt like they were home, felt they could be themselves, felt that they didn't have to justify who it is that they were. So for us, when I was running it, I consider myself the steward of Bob's shop. It was never my print shop. It was always Bob's shop. It still is Bob's shop, and our goal was to make sure anyone who walks through that door feels welcome to make their work. And so if you're going to set up a community organization, that's really what it's about, is creating that environment first that you happen to be making prints in. And so that's my advice to young people, if you're wanting to start something, is you need to get together first. And there has to be that kind of collective need together in order for it to really be able to withstand just the general pressures of operating any organization, running any business of any kind. Because it's a lot of work. It's, I have a friend of mine, my neighbor, he's trying to finish some stuff up for his company so he can sell it. And I always tell him, I was like, you're not a business owner, you're owned by your business. That's what it is in so many ways. When you have a small business, it really has you. And so you need to know that going in, that's what you want, because otherwise it gets really hard, and then the love of it starts to wane. So I'm always like, if you're working with people, you have a chance.
Thank you. There's one more question. Do we have time?
Sure.
Since print is collaborative work, meaning that you work with an artist, what challenges have you often had with an artist that you can think about and share with us? Sorry, I butchered that.
It's okay. Collaborative printing is, your job as a collaborative printer is like 80% therapist, 20% printmaking. That kind of thinks about right. And your whole job is really to create an environment where someone feels comfortable making a mark. And so, imagine yourself walking into a studio, say anywhere from like 3 to 5 people standing around waiting for you to do something to a plate. And the clock's ticking and everybody knows it's cash going out the window, right? So it's, how do you create an environment where that person feels comfortable, right? So, you know, the problems that you generally have as a collaborating printer are usually far less technical than they are like environmental emotional. You know, it's like how you create a situation where someone is really doing something that they're unfamiliar with. So many artists that we work with as collaborating printers have never worked in the processes that we're working with them in before, or the only process experience they have is something in college that they hated. It's like, I can't tell you the number of times someone says, I don't want to do a lithograph. I took a litho course in college and I hate lithography. It was the worst experience of my life. And you're like, great. I have to start off with where they left off, which was the worst experience of my life. Right? It's like, I spent 4 weeks drawing this stone and it's turned to shit in 5 minutes. And I'm just like, they're so mad, and they will never forget that horrific experience. And so now I'm supposed to like make a litho with them. Right. So I have to start there. So much of the problems that you have are helping an artist overcome roadblocks that may be present from past experience or lack of experience, or becoming open and willing to seeing their work in a different way, right? Because when you do a print, you're taking something apart and putting it back together in different ways, and sometimes it's really hard for an artist to see their own process splayed open like that. And so I'd say where you run into most of your problems is helping them get comfortable with being vulnerable with themselves in their own creative process. And it's like 99% of the problems you're going to have, it revolves around they don't like the mark they made. Okay, so we can just throw that away, or I'll burnish it off that plate for them, or I'll make the situation to where they can relax again to get back into the work. Does that make sense? So that's really the most common set of problems. I mean, occasionally you have some sort of real technical snafu, but usually that's so much easier to get over than helping someone through an emotionally tied, difficult process, because they care. Because what it boils down to is the artists you're working with care deeply about their work, and they want it to be good, and they want other people to engage with it in a specific way. And if it's not doing that, or there's a fear of it not doing that, it makes it really hard to work. And so that's your job as a collaborating printer. I mean, if you're an edition printer, your job's getting ink on paper exactly the same all the time, but which I want to point out is not doing the same thing over and over. It's getting the same result over and over, because oftentimes just the climactic changes from the morning to the afternoon means if you do the same thing over and over, that's not going to be the same print over and over. So there's edition printers are like a whole mindset in and of themselves. Like I know a few amazing edition printers, and I'm just like, there's so much better technical printers than I am. But they look at me and they're like, I could never have that conversation you just had with that artist, where I tell them like, yep, that print sucks in a really nice way. We're like, this is not anything anybody wants, and it's okay. We're going to set it over here, and we're going to get some new stuff out, and we're going to go at this again. So like to be able to have that level of a difficult conversation with someone in a way where they feel supported versus feel threatened, that's the real difficulty of the job of a collaborating printer. So yeah, any problems that I've had over the years have all been that. Like one like really odd, funny one was when I was 24. And I was working with an artist who was in her 70s. She'll remain nameless. Everything's going great. We had like 5-day schedule in the studio. We're on day 3. Everything's going awesome. We got like proofs are super far along. She's super excited. We're like having a snack. It's like 3:00 in the afternoon because everybody's needing. That's like the first time anyone's taken a break all day. So it's wasn't even going to be lunch. It was just a snack. And she asked me how old I am. And I told her, I was like, oh, 24. Killed everything. Because she was just like, there was this disconnect. Like in my mind, in her mind, I was so much older. I had to have been so much older for things to be going so well. For my level of experience and competence to press and things like that, I had to have been older. So when that didn't jive for her, that like, wait a minute, how can you be that young? It was like an immediate loss of trust based on a preconceived idea of what age meant. And it was a total collapse of that project. Got it back on track. It all worked out. But man, those are 2 really long days at the back end of that project, because I told someone my age, when I was 24. But, by that time, I mean, the amount of hours on press I'd had up to that point, I might as well have been 35 because of how much work I just had done at that point, the day in and day out, all day, every day, 7 days a week for years at that point. So that my experience level was beyond what you would expect for someone at that age. So yeah, that's just like a really random example of something that went totally off the rails for some like bizarro reason. But that's how important that psychological space is. So for the longest time, I never told anyone how old I was after that because I was like, I'm just not having that problem again. I'll just always be like, I'm Sicilian, blessed with a youthful face. So you just got to go with what you got, So, but yeah, so that's like a really random example, but for the most part, it's really about learning to control that environment.
Thank you. I think that was all the questions from the chat. I don't know if there's more time left.
Yeah, we got a little more time. Phil, do you want to just kind of touch base? I know we've talked about collaboration as a pathway, not just within print, but like another way of kind of working with both industry and kind of the community and other areas. I'm just curious if you had any more comments on that idea, because I know we have a couple different programs within our group tonight, and print's not always the main focus, but collaboration comes in a lot of different areas.
Right. I mean, that touches on I run a consulting company, PS Marlowe, and essentially what I do is a lot of what I've done as a collaborating printer, but just for different results. So whether it be helping a business, a creative services business, like an arts business, overcome major transitions like founder syndrome issues, startup, how galleries can deal with their artists, because, a gallery principle, how they learn to speak about and deal with their artist's presentation of them in the world is really important. And that is a collaboration of how because they have, some parallel goals, but they also have different goals, and how you can work with one another to achieve a similar goal. And so, yeah, the process of collaboration it's a transferable skill. So to just about anything. So people who learn the art of collaboration, which is in so many ways, it's the art of like vision follow through and an ability to not have to have it all be yours, is a really important foundation of collaborative printing that extends out to just about anything else. So if you're going to, when I was running a community-based workshop, it was not about me telling the community what it needed. That was not collaboration. That's not collaboration. So it's about me listening to what the community needs and responding with what it's possible for me to do. And then to find some sort of common ground within there, or even be able to evolve it towards something that neither one of us thought might be possible. And that's really when collaboration comes into its best, is when you listen to what somebody else needs and what they want, and you can present what it is that you need or what you can do, and then see what's possible or how things can evolve within that process moving forward. So from an organizational perspective, I mean, it comes down to, learning how to understand that your idea can be made better, right? So the true skill in collaborative printing is that no idea that you come up with has to be the end all be all idea. That any idea that you can come up with can be improved upon, and that the concept that more brains is better, right? So the more brains you get involved in this, and the more input that can be had, the likelihood of it improving and outperforming expectations and doing something that you couldn't even have imagined in the beginning is increased. Because I have the limited extent of my own vision, of my own imagination. But now if I have somebody else with me and we start having a conversation about an idea or a problem to solve, the likelihood that we can come up with something better is increased because of multiple perspectives. So if anything that the arts can teach you, is one of the main purposes of art is to see the world through someone else's perspective, through someone else's eyes. So an artist, they see the world in one way, they make their work, they're presenting that to us, that we can see the world the way that they see the world, right? So it's a root of empathy. The arts, our creativity, human creativity, is probably our most important thing. It's more important than food, water, and shelter, because without our creative processes, we wouldn't find new water sources when one source runs dry. We'd just be like, oh, there's no more water. I guess we die, right? The reason humans have survived is our ability to adapt based on our creativity, and our creativity is based on our ability to see something from another perspective. So the arts are really integral into maintaining the adaptability of the human species. And so if you can learn to collaborate, that's basically you pulling that collective power, that collective creativity for a larger end. And so collaborative skills training is probably the most important skill moving forward relative to how the economy is evolving. When you think about robots that have been doing most of what a lot of people have been doing. So what do we really have to offer? It's our brains and how we can use those together. And so, when people say, well, what's my art degree really worth? It's learning how to see the world. It's learning how to distill what you've seen into something that you can articulate in some way, whether it be visual or in an auditory format or some other physical format. So to take what's in here and get it out of here. And then how to interact with other people once you've done that. Like, that skill set is extraordinarily important. And it's why arts education is so fundamental, and why we're having a lot of societal problems, because we've eliminated the training of our population to how to use our best and most important skill, how to bolster our adaptability through our creativity. So it's a roundabout way to talk about why collaborative printing is actually super important, because it teaches the most important skills that we have, which is to bolster our adaptability. So any art program that can have elements of collaboration that they can work into it, whether that be doing a community art-based project, whether that, so you have to now interface with the community you're going to work with, understand what it is that they want and need. You got to respond to that to help make something that's going to go into that community. Just learning how to talk to other people, understand what it is they want, and be able to deliver upon that is a huge skill. So community-based art projects are great. Working in collaboration with other artists to produce something together is really great. Working in collaboration to produce something for someone else is really great. Learning how to collaborate with other industries, and so say the sciences or the humanities, or work with an anthropologist to make work is really great, because what you're doing is seeing the world through another perspective, which then alters the way in which you are now seeing the world, which changes what it is that you're putting out into it. So collaboration is, key to essentially everything that we do as human beings. And so any way you can bolster that or create opportunities for you to gain experience and additional skills at collaborating, the better you're going to be at whatever it is you do. Whether that be like making waffles or figuring out how to solve climate change problems, or making a painting. It's all, learning how to ask the question and listen to the answer is just key. Because you may not like what you hear, but once you've heard it, it's not changing. You can't unhear it. So I always encourage, I encourage people who are in school, students, to work collaboratively or work to execute the work of someone else. So you understand what it's like to support someone else's vision. That skill set, it's extraordinarily important to learn. So when I would teach printing in university settings, I always set up projects for one student to print for another student, because all of a sudden you realize that everything matters. Because you're like, oh, I didn't realize that tiny little mark off on the left margin was so important to you when I burned it off your lithostone. And the person's break it down. It's like, what happened to that mark? And you're like, I didn't know. I was like, well, you didn't talk about it. It carries, that was super important for this reason, and now it's gone. So gotta find a way to put it back. So any of those things that you guys can learn or test out or practice that to gain experience and collaboration in any way whatsoever will benefit you in ways that you'll look back on later in your life and go, well, that's really good that I had that skill. And it's totally transferable. So if you decide to be an attorney, like, you'll be a great litigating attorney if you know how to collaborate.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I think if there's no more questions, that was kind of a perfect way to end the conversation. So
good.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I know we've lost a few over the time. One more, there's a chat there.
There's something about if you don't have tools to print. If you're, I'm just going to address the question. It says, due to buys Yemeni artists in Yemen who's dealing with war and don't have tools to print. One of the earliest forms of printing was actually didn't involve ink. So it's technically not printing, but it was actually singeing. So old Tibetan prayer flags, where it was a stone carved with traditional stone carving tools that was heated in a fire, and they would take a thin piece of fabric and they would take a wet board and they would lay it on there, singe it, and pop it off the stone. And so those flags were actually singed instead of printed. And so that to me is like one of the more ingenious ways or methods that I've ever seen anyone replicating or heard of anyone replicating an image. And there's always a way to print. And so any material, relief printing is really the easiest way to go into it, because it's, you carve something away, whatever's raised on the surface, you can apply some sort of material that you can transfer. It doesn't have to be ink. It can be watercolors. It can be Pence graphite. It can be oil that you're now just staining sheets of paper with. There's so many, whatever materials. I mean, a print is, a transfer an image from one surface to another. And so whatever you have access to, you can find a way to make that work. That's why relief printing was the first one, because it's the most simplistic. It's the most portable. The tools for it, you can throw in a backpack. You can find scrap pieces of wood from a burned out or bombed building and go ahead and attack it with a ballpoint pen just to divot the block, and then you can rub it with something you can transfer, whatever that may be. And then, transfer it to anything that you have that you can transfer to, whether it be fabric, old rags, whether it be paper. I mean, it doesn't have to, like, so many of us think of printmaking as being the fancy, expensive art materials. I've done a lot of printing in parts of the world where they just don't have access to any material. So you got to go to a grocery store, try to find like a corner bodega or a whatever their version of a hardware store is, see what you have access to, and you work with it. So that would be my advice, is to think about relief printing and think about it in the terms of what are the images you need to make and why do you need to make them, because that's going to be the driver of everything. And during apartheid South Africa, people were working on all kinds of crazy stuff to make images that represented what was going on in South Africa in the 70s and the 80s, to get those images out to the rest of the world so people could see something. And the artists who are working, like, artists from the Rorke's Drift School and other places like down in Cape Town and stuff, they produced a lot of work that went out, and those images are some of the reasons that, Americans got behind the anti-apartheid movement. So for an artist working in Yemen in a war zone, there's going to be some powerful things that need to be said there. And finding a way to get that out and finding a way to make it in multiple is key. And the most important thing is keep it as simple as humanly possible. Whatever you can find, don't stress the situation any more than it needs to be stressed. And you'll start looking at the world as an opportunity of materials versus thinking, I need these certain tools to do this print in a certain way. It's really more, I have a voice, I have something of value to say. Let's find a way to say it with what I have access to. I think that'll really change that concept. I mean, the singe method is one that, I've always been impressed with. Just singed it. Now it's burned in. It's going to be there. It's on a piece of fabric. So, because that's what you did when you were in several thousand feet up in a super remote monastery. You weren't going to get any ink up there. So, that was some of the earliest forms of printing were done in that way, or even just stamping things in clay and firing them in, cinder block kilns, like homemade clay, and you just stamp them in. And now you're just making new coins or making new mandalas about something. So that would be my advice, is that, value your voice enough to unlock that creativity so that you can get what it is you have to say out into the world.
All right. Thank you, Phil.
You're welcome.
For those that are on, we do have Phil's book in the library. So it's there to check out. And I have another copy in the print shop too. So please reach out if you're looking for it, and happy to get you in touch with Phil at any point. Thank you for joining us. Looking forward to further conversations and studio visits or something in the spring. Hopefully
Sounds
things
good.
are moving towards a better direction by that point. So,
It certainly seems like we're pretty damn close to bottom. So
yeah.
There's that old Bob Dylan line, it can always get worse. So, but the hope, I think for those of us who, have the affliction of the arts, there's a certain level of optimism that comes with that too, because, if you really want to share something with the world, it's because you want it to be a better place in some way. So, if I leave you with anything, is that your voice, value your voice enough to let it matter and to put it in the world. That's what the world needs. So.
All right. Well, good night, everyone. Thanks, Phil. I'll be in touch